Professor Brian Moore, who is joining us from the University of Cambridge. Professor Moore is an Emeritus Professor in the Department of Psychology. His research interests are broad within the field of auditory perception, from hearing aid design and development to perception of music to the theme of this evening, tinnitus. He has published several hundred scientific journal articles and numerous books within this area. And this evening he will be speaking about therapeutic sounds to alleviate tinnitus. We are very pleased to welcome Professor Brian Moore.
Try this trick and walk over to this side, see how it works. Can you get a stereo effect? Okay, I want to talk today about the use of sounds as a therapy for tinnitus. Now, the background to this follows on exactly from what Professor Salvi was talking about. The idea is that tinnitus might start from a problem in the periphery. And by periphery, I mean either the middle ear or the cochlea. They're those two first parts of the auditory system. Something goes wrong in those, so you get a reduced signal travelling up the auditory nerve to the brain, and then the brain is trying to turn up the gain, the volume control, to get some reasonable input. The brain is compensating for that reduced input at the periphery, and that's the origin of tinnitus. And so the idea is that tinnitus arises from damage somewhere in the auditory system, or at least we think that's the case. Now that damage might be something that you can measure with a standard clinical test, which is the audiogram. When you go to a clinic to have your hearing assessed, they'll measure your ability to detect tones of different frequencies. And a plot of the sound level that you need against frequency is the audiogram. That's the standard test. And I guess 20 years ago, it was widely believed that if the audiogram was normal, your hearing was perfectly okay. But now we realise that there are things that can go wrong with your hearing that don't show up in the audiogram, but you might still have some damage to the auditory system that could give rise to tinnitus and cause hearing problems of other kinds as well. And so that's what I refer to as tinnitus with a normal audiogram. And one possible source of that is damage to what are called the synapses that connect the hair cells and the neurons. And Richard Salvi talked about the hair cells in the cochlea that are like microphones that detect the sound, but those microphones, those hair cells are connected to the neurons by structures called synapses, and those synapses can be damaged, and that reduces the flow of information up the auditory nerve, but not necessarily with any effect on the audiogram. And here's a figure that I've stolen from a paper of Kujawa and Lieberman that illustrates that. So these are the hair cells, the inner hair cells that respond to sound. They're detecting vibrations. And here we have a synapse between that hair cell and the neuron. And these are the neurons that go to make up the auditory nerve. And what Kujawa and Lieberman showed was that you could expose an animal to a moderate level of noise, and that would produce damage to these synapses, but it didn't affect the audiogram of the animals. They had a way of assessing the audiogram of the animals too. So you can have damage to these synapses, which reduces the information flowing up the auditory nerve without any effect on the audiogram. So I think one way forward in studying causes of tinnitus is to get better diagnostic tests, ways of figuring out these other things that can go wrong with hearing that don't show up in the audiogram. Okay, now, it's in theory, if you've got a reduced flow of information up the auditory nerve and then the brain's turned up the volume to try and compensate, you could counteract that effect by increasing the input from the periphery. And you could do that either with hearing aids or via the use of therapeutic sounds. So the idea, one theory behind the use of therapeutic sounds is that you expose a person to these sounds. They're getting a consistent flow of information up the auditory nerve, and that can let the brain turn down the gain or the volume control. Well, is there any evidence to support that? Yes, there is. Just go back here. A number of people have shown that if you expose people to either continuous low-level noise or you give them hearing aids that just give a little bit of amplification, then after a while their perception of loudness changes. The way that they judge the loudness of sounds changes. And that's illustrated here. I'm sorry, this looks a bit complicated, but this was a study of Kevin Munro and colleagues at Manchester, where they fitted people with hearing aids that just produced a little bit of amplification, and the hearing aid was presented to one ear only. So we've got an aided ear, that's on the left, and we've got a control ear that didn't get the hearing aid. And this is showing the change in loudness. These are different categories. What they did was to measure the sound level you needed to get the judgment very soft, or comfortable, or loud, or uncomfortably loud. So they measured the sound level needed to get each of those categories, and they found that it changed. And this is how it changed for a sound at 3 kilohertz after either 3 days of exposure here or 5 days of exposure. So they didn't expose people for very long, but after only 5 days, people turned up the volume to get the same judgment of loudness. And even though they were only exposed to relatively low-level sounds, it affected their loudness judgments over a wide range of sound levels. So this is supporting the idea of some sort of plasticity in the brain, and that you can tell the brain to turn down the gain, or to give you a reduced perception of loudness via the use of hearing aids in this example, but it can also be done with other low-level sounds. So this supports the general theory that sounds might be useful in treating tinnitus. Now, I want to just go back a bit to the way people thought about this maybe 40 or 50 years ago. And in those days, it was found that for at least some people with tinnitus, you could reduce the loudness of the tinnitus with an external sound, a so-called masking sound. And if you made that external sound intense enough, you could mask the tinnitus altogether. It would become inaudible. And that worked for some people. And so people thought, oh, well, that's great. We can treat tinnitus just with masking sounds. But it turns out that there's some problem. The effect is highly variable between individuals. So for some people, you give them a constant exposure to noise, it makes things better. For some people, it has no effect. And for some other people, it makes things worse. And we don't really have any explanation for why there are these large individual differences. So that's one problem. Another problem is that, imagine you get a person into your clinic and you put headphones on, you present them with a noise and say, now adjust this noise until you can't quite hear your tinnitus, it's just gone away. And they adjust it, and let's say they adjust it to 30 decibels. Then you wait a few minutes, you just keep the noise playing, and then they say, oh, well, the noise has faded a bit, but now I can hear my tinnitus again. So you say, well, turn the noise up so it still masks your tinnitus, and they turn it up a bit more. And then after a few more minutes, the same thing happens. And after half an hour, they've turned the noise up so much that it's like 90 decibels. It's ridiculously loud and potentially even damaging their hearing. So this suggests that using noise or other sounds to actually mask tinnitus isn't really a practical thing to try to do. So nowadays people talk about these things in a different way. They talk about the use of sounds as a therapy for tinnitus, but not to try to mask the tinnitus. And usually people who believe in the use of these masking sounds, they try to get the person to adjust the volume of the therapeutic sound so it's a similar loudness to the person's tinnitus. And often tinnitus is judged as quite a soft sound. That's not always the case, but for many people tinnitus is not especially loud, but it may have a very annoying sound quality. It may be distressing, but it's not especially loud. And so you can match its loudness with an external sound that's quite soft, and that's what people try to do nowadays. And the theoretical rationales are, well, one is that it might reduce central gain, what I was talking about at the beginning of the talk. It might simply distract attention from the tinnitus, and if you're listening to your therapeutic sound rather than your tinnitus, it might be nicer, and that's sort of it's more pleasant to listen to. But also it may restore a sense of control. The person can adjust the level how they like it in theory, and they can get it at the level that's just right for them to distract them from the tinnitus or make the tinnitus less obtrusive, but not necessarily to mask it. Most hearing aid manufacturers now have built into their hearing aids a program that can generate sounds. It's an option in many hearing aids. They can generate different types of sounds, and I have to say that none of them have undergone any rigorous kind of evaluation to evaluate their effectiveness, but each one says, oh yeah, we've got these really great sounds, and you can try them and see. Now, one thing that's come up is that there are a number of researchers and companies that make these devices for therapeutic sounds have suggested that the sounds that are dynamic in some way are more effective. So rather than having a very steady sound, a stationary sound, like a steady tone or a sh sound, you have a sound that's changing in some way, like tones that are changing in loudness and pitch all the time, or the sound of falling water, or just sounds that are just moving generally. And it may be that they're more effective, they give greater relief just because they're better distractors. A sound that changes is better at grabbing your attention than a sound that's steady. You know, after a while, if you've got air conditioning noise or noise from a projector or something like that, you don't notice it until it goes off. When somebody switches off the sound off, you suddenly notice it's missing. So the brain kind of tunes into sounds that are changing and tends to ignore things that are constant. And so these sounds that are used to it as providing relief from tinnitus may be more effective when they change, just because they're better at grabbing your attention. And in a study by Henry and colleagues done in the USA, they compared the effectiveness of several types of static sounds and dynamic sounds, and generally they found that the dynamic sounds were more effective and the steady filtered noises in providing tinnitus relief. And here the subjects were just asked subjectively about the amount of distress that the tinnitus was producing, and that the dynamic sounds produced a greater reduction in distress. Now, and another study was conducted by Revis and colleagues, same kind of thing, a similar idea, and they found that more than 50% of their participants reported an actual change in the loudness of the tinnitus, which is unusual. In many studies, people have found that external sounds reduce the distress from tinnitus, but don't actually make it less loud. In this study, they claimed that the dynamically varying sounds that they used actually reduced the loudness of the tinnitus, more for the dynamic sounds than for the steady sounds. And this occurred even when these therapeutic sounds were judged as being softer than the tinnitus, even when they were less loud than the tinnitus. And they called this effect suppression of tinnitus rather than the masking of tinnitus. Now, one drawback with most of these studies is that they haven't been done in a properly controlled trial. Now, if a medicine is being evaluated, a drug treatment, let's say, to see if it's going to be given on the National Health Service, the gold standard is to do what's called a double-blind controlled trial. Double-blind means that the experimenter doesn't know who's getting what treatment, and the patient doesn't know whether they're getting the treatment or not. And you compare an active group that's getting the treatment and a control group that receives a placebo, and in a drug trial that might be another pill or another injection. So nobody knows who's getting what until the end. You evaluate the outcomes and then you unblind it and look at who got what treatment. And that's a completely unbiased way of assessing whether a treatment is working or not. Unfortunately, for the case of tinnitus, it's hard to choose an appropriate placebo to evaluate the effect of these maskers. It's not appropriate just to do nothing, just to put somebody on the waiting list. They should get some kind of treatment, but what, we don't know. So I think that the most valid thing that you can do is to compare different kinds of tinnitus sounds and see if some are having a bigger effect than others. But even then, the patient is not blind because they know what different sounds they're listening to. So it's really hard to do a decent controlled study, but I think we need them. At present, there are few, or I haven't found any trials that I really think satisfy the standards of a double-blind trial to know whether these therapeutic sounds are really effective. I think there's some evidence that time-varying sounds may help a bit, but there's certainly going to be a lot of individual variability, and maybe the best advice is just, if your hearing aid has an option for these kinds of sounds, try them and see if they help you, and they may do, but they may not. So just to give you some summary and take-home messages, for some people you can reduce tinnitus in loudness or even abolish it by background sounds, but to actually mask tinnitus you may need sound levels that over a long time become unacceptably loud. So it's not in practice useful to try to actually mask tinnitus to make it go away with background sounds, but low-level sounds may provide relief from tinnitus by distracting attention from the tinnitus or by reducing the central gain, the brain mechanism that's increased the volume, and these low-level sounds may be effective in doing that. Dynamic sounds may be more effective than steady sounds, but we really need more research with proper controlled trials to evaluate how well these therapeutic sounds really work. Thank you very much.